Keth Voren stood at the observation deck of the carrier ship and watched the blue planet grow larger through the reinforced glass window, and he felt nothing but contempt for the world below, for he had been taught since birth that the Silthari Dominion was the supreme power in the galaxy, and no species had ever proven otherwise. He was young by his people's standards, barely 30 cycles old, but he had already participated in the conquest of 2 worlds, and had earned his place among the warrior caste through blood and discipline, and his carapace bore the ceremonial scars that marked him as a proven hunter. The Silthari were magnificent creatures by any measure, standing over 8 feet tall with natural armor that could deflect primitive projectiles, and reflexes that made them nearly impossible to ambush. And their eyes could see in spectrums that most species could not even imagine, and their strength allowed them to tear through metal with their bare. Fleet Commander Zeltharis had assembled 12 carrier ships and 40,000 ground troops for this invasion, and many had whispered that such a force was excessive for a primitive world like Earth. But the commander believed in overwhelming displays of power, for conquered species were less likely to rebel if they understood from the first moment that resistance was utterly pointless. Keth Voren had reviewed the intelligence reports on humans with amusement, and he had laughed at the images of these soft pink creatures with their thin skin and flat teeth and their strange coverings they called clothing, and he wondered how such fragile beings had even survived on their own world long enough to develop technology. The reports said that humans had short lifespans of less than 100 cycles, and they spent much of that time fighting among themselves over resources and ideology, and things the Silthari could not even comprehend. Discovered how to leave their own planet, and their weapons were primitive chemical propellants and crude explosives. Captain Morveth gathered the third wave in the briefing chamber and explained their mission with the casual confidence of someone describing a routine exercise. And Keth Voren listened as the captain pointed to maps of a human settlement called Chicago and outlined the landing zones and the expected timeline for total pacification. "We will secure this sector within 1 rotation," Morveth said, his deep voice resonating through the chamber. "And the humans will either submit or die, and those who submit will be processed for the labor camps, and those who resist will serve as examples to the others." Keth Voren felt excitement building in his chest as he checked his plasma rifle for the 10th time and ran his claws along the edge of his combat blade, and he thought about the glory he would earn and the stories he would tell when he returned home. He imagined the admiration of the females and the respect of the elders. The dropships launched in perfect formation, and Keth Voren pressed his face against the small porthole to watch Earth's atmosphere wrap around them like a burning embrace. And the ship shook and rattled as they descended through layers of cloud and wind, and he gripped his weapon tighter and prepared for the landing. The first explosion came without warning, and Keth Voren was thrown against the wall as the dropship lurched violently to the side. And through the porthole, he saw one of the other ships transformed into a ball of fire and debris, and then another ship exploded, and then another. And the calm voice of the pilot announced that they were under attack from surface-based weapons. "Impossible!" someone shouted. "The humans do not have weapons that can reach us at this altitude." But the evidence was burning and falling all around them, and Keth Voren felt something cold creep into his chest. Something he had never experienced before. Something that might have been the first whisper of fear. Their dropship survived the descent through skill or luck or perhaps both, and it crashed into a wide-open space that the humans called Grant Park. And the impact threw Keth Voren from his seat and sent equipment scattering across the floor. But his armor absorbed the shock, and he was on his feet within seconds. Captain Morveth kicked open the damaged hatch and led them into the alien world, and Keth Voren followed with his rifle raised and his senses alert. And he expected to see panicking crowds of humans fleeing in terror from their arrival. Instead, He found empty streets stretching in every direction, and tall buildings of glass and steel standing silent, like monuments to an abandoned civilization, and vehicles sitting motionless on paths of black stone, and not a single living creature in sight. "They have fled," Morveth announced. "The cowards have abandoned their city rather than face us." But something felt wrong to Kethvorin, and he could not explain why his instincts were screaming at him to be cautious. And he looked at the dark windows of the surrounding buildings, and wondered if they were truly empty, or if something was watching them from the shadows. The captain organized the survivors into formation, and ordered an advance toward the city center. And they moved through the streets with weapons ready, their boots echoing on the hard ground, and the silence pressed against them like a physical weight. Kethvorin noticed small details that troubled him as they marched, and he saw that the vehicles had been arranged in patterns that channeled movement in specific directions. And he saw that certain doorways had been sealed, while others were left invitingly open. And he saw marks on the ground that suggested heavy objects had been moved recently. He tried to report his observations to Captain Morveth, but the captain dismissed his concerns with a wave of his claw, and said that Kethvorin was simply nervous because this was his first major planetary invasion, and the veterans around him chuckled at his inexperience. They had traveled 6 blocks when the world exploded around them. The ground beneath their feet erupted in fire and shrapnel, and Kethvorin was lifted off his feet and thrown through the air, and he landed hard on his back and felt his armor crack from the impact, and his ears rang with a sound like thunder that would not stop. He rolled onto his stomach and looked up to see his comrades dying in droves, and the flash of weapons came from windows and rooftops and doorways in every direction, and the humans had been waiting for them all along, and the empty city had been a trap, and they had walked into it like foolish prey. Kethvorin crawled toward cover as projectiles screamed past his head, and he saw Captain Morveth standing in the middle of the street trying to rally the troops, and then the captain's chest exploded outward in a spray of blue blood, and he fell and did not rise again. The young warrior found shelter behind a burning vehicle and pressed his back against the hot metal and tried to breathe. And he realized that everything he had been taught about humans was wrong, and these were not helpless prey animals waiting to be harvested. And he had made a terrible mistake coming to this world. The sounds of battle raged around him as his people died, and Kethvorin understood for the first time in his life what it meant to be hunted. Danny Reyes had been a Marine for 3 years before the aliens arrived, and he had served in places where death was always close, but nothing had prepared him for the moment when the first reports came in about ships descending from the sky over a dozen cities around the world. He remembered sitting in the barracks at Camp Pendleton when the emergency broadcast interrupted everything, and he remembered the faces of his fellow soldiers as they watched footage of massive vessels blocking out the sun. And he remembered thinking that his life and the life of everyone he loved was about to change forever. The military had responded with speed that surprised even Danny, and within hours he was on a transport heading toward Chicago, with orders to join the defense force being assembled by General Patricia Webb. And the general had a reputation for being brilliant and ruthless, and soldiers who served under her said she thought 10 moves ahead of everyone else, to find a city being evacuated in organized chaos. And civilians streamed westward in endless rivers of cars and buses and people on foot. And military vehicles pushed against the flow, heading toward the expected landing zones. And the air was thick with the sound of helicopters and the distant thunder of artillery being positioned. Danny was assigned to a unit under Sergeant Corey Price, a veteran of 3 combat deployments who spoke in short sentences and never wasted words. And Price gathered his squad in an empty office building and explained what they were going to do. "We're not meeting them head-on," Price said, his voice calm as if he were discussing a training exercise. "We're going to let them land and let them think they've won the first round, and then we're going to show them what happens when you invade our home." The plan was simple in concept, but required perfect coordination, and Danny spent the next 18 hours helping to prepare the city. Kind of warfare the aliens had clearly never encountered, and they buried explosives in the streets, and set up hidden firing positions, and created kill zones that would channel the enemy into killing fields. Engineers rigged buildings to collapse on command, and snipers found perches with overlapping fields of fire, and communication lines were established through underground tunnels and backup frequencies that the aliens would not be able to jam. And Danny realized he was witnessing the birth of a new kind of war. He took his position on the 14th floor of an office tower and watched through his scope as the alien dropships descended through the clouds, and his heart pounded against his ribs, but his hands remained steady, because Price had taught him that fear was natural, but panic was a choice. The first ships exploded before they even reached the ground, and Danny felt a surge of fierce pride as he watched the missiles find their targets, and he knew that all over the city, similar scenes were playing out, and the aliens were learning their first hard lesson about humanity. The survivors landed in the park below, and emerged from their ships looking confused and angry, and Danny studied them through his scope, and noted their size and their armor and the way they moved, and he marked the weak points at their joints, and the gaps near their heads where their protection was thinner. They were big and they were scary, but Danny had fought big and scary before, and he knew that everything that lived could also die, and his job was to prove that truth to these invaders, one trigger pull at a time. Sergeant Price held up 3 fingers and began the countdown, and Danny took a breath and let it out slowly, and placed his finger on the trigger. And when the signal came, he fired, and watched an alien warrior stumble, as the round found the gap between its shoulder plates. The street below became a scene from a nightmare, as explosions tore through the alien formation, and gunfire poured down from every direction, and the invaders who had expected terrified civilians found themselves surrounded by trained killers who had been preparing for this moment since the first ship appeared in orbit. Danny fired again and again, picking his targets with care, and he watched the aliens fall and felt no mercy, because they had come to his world uninvited, and they had come to take everything he cared about, and he would make them pay for every inch of ground in blood. The aliens tried to form defensive positions, but the ambush was too well coordinated, and every time they found cover, another explosion would force them to move, and every time they moved, more bullets found them, and their numbers dwindled with terrible speed. One group of survivors retreated into a building across the street, and Danny watched them barricade the entrance and knew what was about to happen. And he felt a grim satisfaction when the killer charges detonated, and the whole structure came crashing down in a cloud of dust and debris. Sergeant Price's voice came through the radio, telling them to relocate to secondary positions, and Danny grabbed his equipment and moved through the building to the exit route they had prepared, and he emerged in a back alley where the rest of his squad was already waiting. "Good work," Price said without looking up from his map. "We've got reports of another group pushing toward Michigan Avenue, and Command wants us to cut them off before they can link up with any survivors from the park." Danny nodded and checked his ammunition and fell into formation with his squad mates, and they moved through the empty city like ghosts, using the routes they had memorized and the shortcuts only locals would know. They found the alien group 3 blocks east of their target, and this time the creatures were moving more carefully, and they were checking corners and watching the windows. And they had learned something from the massacre at the park. But learning and adapting were 2 different things, and Danny knew that humans had been fighting wars against each other since before they had written language. And they had thousands of years of practice at the art of killing, and these aliens were about to receive an education. The squad waited until the enemy was deep in the kill zone, and then they sprung the trap, and once again the streets filled with fire and blood, and the screams of dying invaders. Danny fought until his rifle was empty, and then fought with his sidearm until that was empty too. And when the last alien fell, he stood among the bodies and breathed in the smoke and cordite, and he thought about his family somewhere safe to the west, and he thought about all the people who were counting on soldiers like him to hold the line. Sergeant Price clapped him on the shoulder and said they did good work, and then he ordered them to reload and prepare to move out, because there were more aliens still alive in the city, and the night was young, and humanity had a message to send to the stars. Danny Reyes had been a Marine for 3 years before the aliens arrived, and now he understood why he had been born, and his purpose was to stand between his world and anything that threatened it, and he would fulfill that purpose until his last breath. Admiral Victor Huang stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier USS Defiance and watched the tactical display showing the battle unfolding in orbit, and he felt the weight of command pressing down on his shoulders, because the fate of billions rested on the decisions he would make in the next few hours. The situation in space was grim, but not hopeless, and Earth's combined fleet was hopelessly outgunned by the alien armada. But Huang had not risen to his rank by fighting fair, and he had studied the enemy's movements since the first moment of contact, and he had begun to see patterns in how they operated. The aliens fought like creatures who had never faced real resistance, and their formations were rigid and predictable, and they responded to threats in the same way every time, and Huang realized that for all their advanced technology, they had forgotten how to adapt. He ordered his ships to fire in seemingly random spreads, not trying to hit the enemy, but tracking how they evaded, and he noted the direction and speed of their evasive maneuvers. And he fed the data into the computers and let the analysts build a model of their behavior. While his ships danced with death in the void above, Huang contacted his counterparts in other navies around the world, and old rivals became instant allies as Chinese and Russian and European commanders shared information and coordinated their efforts. And for perhaps the first time in human history, the species fought as one. Admiral Shen Wei of the Chinese Space Force provided data from their tracking stations, and Admiral Petrov of the Russian Navy offered the use of their submarine-launched missiles. And Admiral Laurent of the European Coalition contributed targeting algorithms their scientists had developed. And together, they assembled a picture of the enemy that no single nation could have created alone. The alien command ship hung at the center of their formation, like a queen on a bar chessboard, and Huang could see that all their coordination flowed from that single vessel, and he knew that if they could destroy it, the entire invasion would fall into chaos. But the command ship was protected by a ring of escort vessels that could intercept any attack long before it reached its target, and conventional tactics would never penetrate that defense, and Huang needed something unexpected. He called Captain Rosa Martinez to the bridge, and she was the commander of the destroyer USS Chicago, and she was known throughout the fleet for her courage and her willingness to take risks that other captains would not consider. "I need 3 ships for a mission," Huang told her, "and I need captains who understand that they may not come back." Martinez did not hesitate before volunteering her own vessel, and within the hour, 2 other captains had joined her, and Huang briefed them on a plan that made even these hardened warriors pause. Would make a run at the alien formation in a pattern designed to look desperate rather than deliberate, and they would allow themselves to be targeted and attacked, and one of them would be crippled and sent drifting toward the command ship. The aliens would ignore the dying ship because it posed no threat, and they would not suspect that the ship's reactor had been modified to go critical on command, and they would not know that hidden in its cargo bay were 40 nuclear warheads salvaged from decommissioned missiles. Martinez shook his hand and said it was an honor to serve under his command, and Huang told her that the honor was his, and then he watched her walk away to prepare her crew for what might be their final mission. The battle began at dawn by Earth time, and the 3 destroyers accelerated toward the alien formation at maximum speed. And the enemy responded exactly as Huang had predicted, and they turned their weapons on the approaching ships. Contemptuous ease. The first destroyer exploded in a ball of fire, and the second followed moments later, and the USS Chicago took multiple hits that tore through its hull and left it spinning helplessly toward the alien lines. And Martinez's final transmission reported that all escape pods had been launched, and the skeleton crew remaining aboard had accepted their fate. Huang watched the crippled ship drift closer to the command ship, and he watched the aliens ignore it because it was just another piece of debris in a battle they were winning. And he felt his heart pounding as the distance closed. The detonation was visible from Earth's surface, and witnesses described a new sun being born in the night sky that burned for several seconds before fading. And the electromagnetic pulse alone disabled dozens of alien vessels. And the nuclear fire consumed the command ship, and everything within 3 kilometers of its position. As individual ships lost coordination with each other, and Huang ordered his remaining vessels to press the attack, and they found easy targets among the confused and disorganized enemy. On the ground, the effect was immediate, and the alien troops who had been fighting with disciplined coordination suddenly began acting independently. And they made mistakes they would never have made with proper leadership, and human forces exploited every error with ruthless efficiency. General Webb in Chicago reported that enemy resistance was crumbling, and similar reports came in from Tokyo and London and Sydney and every other city where the invaders had landed, and within hours it became clear that the tide had turned. Huang allowed himself a moment of satisfaction before turning his attention to the next phase of the battle. And there were still thousands of aliens on Earth's surface who needed to be dealt with, and there were still enemy ships in orbit that could threaten civilian populations. He thought about Captain Martinez and her crew, and all the others who had given their lives to make this victory possible. And he swore that their sacrifice would not be wasted, and he would hunt down every last invader until Earth was free again. The universe had sent its champions to conquer humanity, and humanity had responded with fire and fury, and the kind of desperate courage that only beings fighting for their homes could summon. And the universe was learning that this small blue world was not to be taken lightly. Admiral Huang looked at the tactical display, showing the scattered remains of the alien fleet, and allowed himself a small smile. And he thought that if any other civilizations were watching this battle, they would think twice before trying their luck against Earth. The humans had been underestimated, and the price of that mistake was being paid in alien blood. And Huang intended to make sure the lesson was never forgotten. Keth Vorin had been alone for 6 days, and he had learned more about fear in that time than in all his previous years of life. And the creature who had descended to Earth, expecting easy conquest, had been stripped away layer by layer, until only a frightened survivor remained. He moved through the ruins of the human city at night, when the darkness gave him some small advantage. And he hid during the day in basements and sewers and anywhere the humans might not think to look. And he survived on emergency rations that were nearly exhausted, and water he collected from broken pipes. The invasion had failed completely, and he had received the last transmission from Fleet Command before the command ship's destruction. And the message had ordered all units to retreat to extraction points. But there were no extraction points left, because human aircraft had destroyed every landing zone. Keth Vorin had tried to join other survivors, and he had followed the sound of Sothari, weapons only to arrive and find bodies cooling on the ground and humans picking through the equipment. And he had watched from the shadows as they studied the plasma rifles and armor with expressions of curiosity rather than fear. The humans hunted his people with terrifying efficiency, and they used animals called dogs that could track alien scent across kilometers. And they used machines that could see heat and movement through walls. And they used captured Silthari weapons with disturbing competence. He had witnessed a human soldier demonstrate a plasma rifle to her companions, and she had figured out the firing mechanism and the power settings within minutes of picking it up. and she had used it to bring down a Silthari warrior who had been hiding in a nearby building. But the thing that haunted Kethvoran most was not the killing, and it was not the efficiency or the weapons or the tactics, and it was something far more disturbing that he had difficulty putting into words. He had found the remains of a Silthari patrol that had surrendered, and their bodies showed no signs of torture or cruelty, and they had simply been killed quickly and cleanly and left where they fell. And the humans had not wanted prisoners or slaves or anything the Dominion would have taken from a conquered enemy. They wanted only destruction, and they wanted to erase the threat and move on to the next target. And there was something deeply unsettling about enemies who killed without hatred or anger, but simply because killing was the most efficient solution. Kethvoran had intercepted human communications using a damaged radio he had salvaged from a wrecked vehicle, and he struggled to decode their primitive signals and understand their strange language. But eventually, he learned enough to follow their conversations. What he heard changed everything he thought he knew about these creatures. The human soldiers did not sound frightened, desperate, and they did not speak like beings fighting for survival against overwhelming odds, and their voices were calm and professional, and sometimes even cheerful, and they discussed hunting Silthari the way Kethvoran's people discussed tracking game animals. One conversation in particular burned itself into his memory, and it was between a female soldier and her commanding officer, and her voice was light with dark humor as she said something that translated roughly as, "Remember when we thought we were alone in the universe, and that was scary? Turns out we're not alone, and that's worse for them." The other soldiers had laughed at this, and Kethvoran had crouched in his hiding place and felt a chill run through his entire body, because he understood what she meant. And he understood that these creatures were not prey who had gotten lucky. Humans had been fighting each other since the dawn of their species, and they had developed weapons and tactics and strategies through thousands of years of constant warfare, and they had honed the art of killing to a degree that the Silthari had never imagined possible. His people were conquerors who had crushed weak civilizations that could not resist them, but they had never faced an enemy that truly fought back, and they had grown soft and arrogant because victory had always come easily. The humans were different, and every human alive was descended from ancestors who had survived wars and plagues and disasters, and their very existence was proof that they could endure anything the universe threw at them. And now the universe had thrown the Silthari at them. Kethvoran thought about his homeworld and his family and his dreams of glory, and he thought about how foolish he had been to think that size and strength and technology made the Silthari superior, and he realized that true predators were measured not by their bodies, but by their will to survive. He spent the seventh night hiding in a collapsed building and listening to human patrols pass within meters of his position, and he heard them joking and talking about their families and making plans for what they would do when the fighting was over. And they sounded so normal, so ordinary, so much like the Silthari had sounded before battles in the past. But there was a difference, and it took him hours to identify what it was, and when he finally understood, it made him want to flee this world and never look back. The Silthari had always fought with confidence, because they knew they would win, and their certainty came from their superiority over weaker enemies. And when that superiority was challenged, they fell apart. The humans fought with confidence too, but their certainty did not come from knowing they would win, and it came from something deeper and more frightening, and it came from a complete acceptance of death, combined with an absolute refusal to let that death be meaningless. They were willing to die, and they expected to die, and knowing they would die made them more dangerous rather than less, because they had nothing to lose and everything to protect. And Kethvoran understood that you could not defeat an enemy who had already accepted the worst possible outcome. On the 8th morning, He made his decision, and he would find a way off this nightmare world, and he would return to the Dominion and tell them what he had seen, and he would warn them that humanity was not a species to be conquered. Gentle face. And if the Silthari were wise, they would never return to this world, and they would never give these terrible creatures a reason to look toward the stars with vengeance in their hearts. Kethvaran began moving toward the edge of the city, and every shadow held potential death, and every sound made him flinch, and he had become the prey he had always hunted, and the irony was not lost on him. The humans had taught him what fear truly meant, and it was a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life. Lieutenant Commander Grace Whitfield was part of the team that found the last surviving alien, and she had been hunting Silthari for 3 weeks when the thermal sensors picked up a single heat signature in a subway tunnel beneath what had once been downtown Detroit. The alien was in terrible condition when they surrounded him, and he was half-starved and wounded in multiple places, and he clutched an empty plasma rifle like a child holding a favorite toy. And when the flashlights found him, he did not fight, or run, or even try to hide. He simply stared at the human soldiers, with huge dark eyes that reflected the light, and Grace saw something in that gaze that she had never expected to see from one of the invaders, and it was a mixture of awe and terror and something that might have been respect. "Hold fire," she ordered, and her squad obeyed immediately, because they trusted her judgment, and she approached the alien slowly, with her weapon lowered and her hands. The creature flinched when she got close, but did not move, and she could see his wounds up close now, and realized that he had been running for days, and she wondered what it must have been like for him to watch his entire invasion force destroyed, while he scrambled through the ruins trying to survive. They took him to a holding facility in what had been Denver, and scientists and linguists worked around the clock to establish communication, and the alien seemed eager to cooperate, despite everything that had happened between their species. His name was Kethvaran, and he was young by Silthari standards, and he had come to Earth expecting to earn glory through easy conquest, and instead he had found something that had shattered every assumption he had ever held about his people and their place in the universe. The translation process took 3 weeks of patient work, and Grace was present for many of the sessions because she had been assigned as his primary security officer, and she found herself developing something like sympathy for this creature who had been so thoroughly humbled by her species. General Webb authorized his release after lengthy debates at the highest levels of government, and the decision was controversial because many wanted to keep him prisoner, or worse. But the general understood something that the angry crowds did not. Letting him go was not mercy, and it was strategy, and it was a message to whatever civilization had sent him. They gave Kethvaran a small shuttle repaired from the wreckage of his own fleet, and it was barely functional, but capable of making a single journey to the nearest Silthari outpost, and on the day of his departure, Grace was assigned to escort him to the launch site. They stood together on the tarmac as technicians made final preparations, and the morning sun was warm on Grace's face, and she looked at this alien who had come to enslave her world and felt no hatred toward him, because he had already suffered enough. "I have a question," she said through the translator device, "and you don't have to answer if you don't want to." Kethvaran turned to face her and waited, and his body language had changed completely since his capture, and he no longer held himself with the arrogance of a conqueror, but with the caution of someone who had learned humility the hard way. "What will you tell your people about us?" Grace asked. The alien was silent for a long moment, and she could see him struggling to find words that would capture what he had experienced. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that the translator could not fully convey. "I will tell them that in all our centuries of conquest, we never understood what predators truly were," he said, and his eyes never left hers, "and we thought that size and strength and technology made us supreme. and you have shown us how wrong we were. At the sky, as if imagining the long journey ahead, and then he continued speaking in a voice that had grown soft with something like wonder. You are small and fragile, and your lives are brief, but you have something my people lack, and it is something I cannot fully explain, because I do not have words for it in my language. Try, Grace said. You have no limit to what you will do to survive, Kethvaron said, and you have no cruelty you will not embrace when your existence is threatened, and you have no sacrifice you will not make for those you love, and this makes you the most dangerous species we have ever encountered. He turned back to face her and made a gesture that might have been a bow or a salute or something else entirely. I came to your world thinking I would find helpless prey, he said, and instead I found horror wearing a gentle face, and I will spend the rest of my life warning my people to leave you in peace. Into the shuttle and seal the hatch, and she watched the engines ignite, and the small vessel rise into the sky, and she watched until it was nothing but a speck against the blue, and then nothing at all. 6 months later, a diplomatic vessel from the Silthari Dominion arrived in Earth orbit, and it came not with weapons, but with gifts, and it came not to conquer, but to negotiate. The aliens offered technology and trade and alliance, and they offered humanity a place among the galactic powers, and they asked only for peace. And in the chambers where these negotiations took place, the human diplomats smiled their gentle smiles and spoke their soft words. Grace was part of the security detail for those first meetings, and she watched the Silthari representatives try not to flinch when humans walked past them, and she saw the fear hiding behind their formal courtesies, and she understood that Kethvaron had kept his promise. Throughout the Dominion and beyond, and civilizations that had never heard of humanity before now spoke the name with caution, and species that might have considered Earth a target now reconsidered their plans. The galaxy had learned a lesson that humans had always known, and it was a lesson written in blood and fire and the ashes of 40,000 invaders who had made the mistake of underestimating the creatures of the small blue world. Humanity was not the prey. It had never been the prey. From the first moment their ancestors had picked up rocks and sharpened sticks, and looked at the predators around them with defiance rather than fear, they had been the hunters, and the universe was only now beginning to understand what that meant. Grace Whitfield stood at the window of the diplomatic facility and looked up at the stars, and she thought about all the civilizations out there watching and wondering, and she hoped they would choose peace because humanity was tired of war. But if they chose otherwise, if they came to Earth with conquest in their hearts, they would find the same welcome that the Silthari had received, and they would learn the same lesson that Kethvaron now carried among the stars. Humanity had looked into the darkness between worlds and found it full of monsters, and the monsters had looked back and discovered that the true horror had been on Earth all along. The universe would never forget what happened when the Silthari came to Earth. And Grace smiled as she watched the alien diplomats shuffle nervously through the halls, and she thought that perhaps this was the beginning of a new era. An era where humanity took its rightful place among the stars, and where the galaxy learned to respect the small, fragile creatures who had proven themselves to be the most terrifying predators of all. The war was over, and humanity had won, and the future stretched out before them, bright with possibility. Grace looked forward to seeing what her species would become, now that the universe knew what they truly were. They were survivors, and they were fighters, and they were the children of a world that had tried to kill them 1,000 times, and failed. And nothing in all the cosmos could break them, because they had been forged in struggle since the first dawn. They were human, and that was enough.